Here we're going to talk about solving absolute value equations, but before I start talking about that, I want to make sure we have a clear understanding about what absolute value actually is. The absolute value is the distance away from zero a number is on the number line. So for example, negative 2 is right here, okay? And the distance that is away from 0 is 1, 2. So the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. Distance can only be positive. Okay, now how about positive 2? Positive 2 is right here, and that is also 2 spots away from 0. So the absolute value of 2 is also 2. Okay, so we got absolute value pretty much figured out. Now it's time to solve some equations. When we solve absolute value equations, the first thing we need to do is to isolate the absolute value. When I say isolate, I mean get it by itself. So we need to get everything that's not the absolute value to the other side, or everything that's not inside the absolute value. So we need to get rid of this negative 5. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides. Both sides of the equation, that is. And then we're going to simplify. Now that we have isolated the absolute value, as you can see, there's nothing being added, subtracted to it. There's nothing being multiplied, and there's nothing being divided. So it's all by itself. Now we're going to split it into two equations, because we saw up here that the absolute value can be two different numbers. So both these are equal to 2, but the absolute value of negative 2 and 2 works. So we need to work with both situations. So we're going to split this equation into two different equations to cover both the negative and positive side of the absolute value. If you'll take notice that we split them into two equations, and also we split them into a positive output and a negative output. That covers the both sides of the absolute value that we were talking before. The negative equals the positive and the positive equals the positive. Same thing goes here. The 3x minus 4 can be negative 3. The 3x minus 4 can equal positive 3. So now we just solve it just like any other multi-step algebra equation, and we can get your answers. After we solve each equation for the given variable, we're left with two answers. X equals 7 over 3 and x equals 1 over 3. And we're going to write our answer in set notation since we have more than one answer. So we're going to say x equals the set. I'm going to make that better. The set containing 1/3 and 7/3. Okay? That is our final answer. Next, I'm going to have a couple more examples, but after that, you're free to go. Alright, let's try this one. We got 2 times the absolute value of 4x minus 7 plus 5 equals 17. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking this, that, hey, why don't we just distribute this 2 to both these terms? You cannot do that. Can't do that. The absolute value does not follow the distributive property. It's its own little function. The absolute value tells you how far a number is away from 0. So you cannot distribute. It's not grouping symbols. So let's follow it. Let's solve it just like we did the other one. We're going to isolate the absolute value first. So we need to solve. We need to get this part all by itself. So we're going to get rid of this 5. So we're going to subtract 5 to both sides. And we're left with 2 times the absolute value of 4x minus 7 equals 12. Now we need to get rid of this 2. So we're going to divide both sides by 2. And finally we're left with absolute value of 4x minus 7 equals 6. Okay? Since the absolute value is isolated, it's all by itself, there's no multiplication or division or addition or subtraction. Now we can split into two different equations. One positive, one negative. Okay? Because remember, we can get the same answer for absolute values for positive and negative. They both would yield a 6. Now we need to solve it just like a normal equation. Adding 7 to both sides on both equations. We're left with 4x equals 13 And then last but not least, opposite of multiply is divide. And we're left with x equals 13 over 4 and x equals 1 over 4. So our solution is x equals 1 over 4, 13 over 4. Here we have looks like a pretty complicated problem, but we're just going to take it step by step and figure it out as we go. So we have an absolute value equation. We need to solve it. So the first thing is to isolate the absolute value. So we're going to get rid of, not necessarily in order, but we're going to get rid of this 2, we're going to get rid of this 8, and this negative. First thing first, let's get rid of that 2. And that leaves us with a negative 7p plus 4 over 8 equals negative 3. Now we can either get rid of this 8 or this negative first. It doesn't really matter. But just for whatever, let's just get rid of 8 first. Since we're dividing by 8 here, we're going to multiply by 8 to undo that. So we got negative 7p plus 4 equals negative 24. Now we need to get rid of this negative. So I'm going to divide both sides by negative 1. Alright, now the absolute value is isolated. We can split into two equations, one positive, one negative. Now we're going to solve both those equations, just like any other equation we've done. Okay, divide both sides by 7. Almost done here. We have p equals 20 over 7, and p equals negative 4. So p is equal to the set negative 4 and 20 over 7. After watching that video, you should feel comfortable with at least these problems. If you have any problems, make sure to contact me and I'll help you out. Enjoy.